Chapter 8. 3 days had passed when Doc spotted his first runner. The tractor was ploughing through the sand, heading towards a new village for a one-night stay. Lou was driving, while Doc and Jake sat silently in the back, paying no attention to the colors that were painted over the dunes. The cat-and-mouse game was wearing on Doc. There was no guarantee that the village they were approaching might not be the target the lobby had chosen for the next investigation. Suddenly, Lou slammed on the brakes and pointed. A figure was running frantically over one of the low dunes with the little red sun behind him. He seemed to be heading towards them, but as he drew closer, they could see that he had no definite direction. He simply ran, pumping his legs frantically as if all the devils of hell were after him. His body swayed from side to side in exhaustion, but his arms and legs pumped on. "Stop him!" Jake ordered, and Lou swung the tractor. It halted squarely in the runner's path, and the figure struck against it and toppled. The legs went on pumping, digging into the dirt and gravel, but the man was too far gone to rise. Jake and Lou shoved him through the doors into the tractor, and Doc yanked off his aspirator. The man was giving vent to a kind of ululating cry, weakened now almost to a whine that rose and fell with the motion of his legs. Sweat had once streaked his haggard face, but it was dry and blanched to a pasty grey. Doc injected enough narcotic to quiet a maddened bull. It had no effect, except to upset the rhythm of the arms and legs. It took 5 more minutes for the man to die. The specks were larger this time, the size of periods in 12-point type. The lump at the base of the skull was as big as a small hen's egg. "From Edison, like the others so far. Jack Cooley?" Jake answered Doc's question. "Durwood spent a lot of time here on his first expedition, so it's getting the worst of it." Doc pulled the aspirator mask back over the man's face, and they carried him out and laid him on a low dune. They couldn't risk returning the corpse to its people. This was only the primary circle of infection, direct from Durwood. The second circle could be 10 times as large, as the infection spread from one to a few to many. So far, it was localized, but it wouldn't stay that way. Doc climbed slowly out of the tractor, carrying his small supplies of equipment, while Jake made arrangements for them to spend the night in a deserted house. But the figure of the runner and his own failures to find more about the disease kept haunting Doc. He began setting up his equipment grimly. "Better get some sleep," Jake suggested. Miley rubbed his tired eyes and surveyed the chemicals and tools scattered on the table in front of him. He had been experimenting with various combinations for hours, but nothing seemed to work. He closed the case with a sigh and slammed his hand on the table in frustration. Jake, his colleague, suggested they reach out to Molly at the Tanana house for more supplies. Miley agreed, but Doc, their leader, insisted on going alone. He knew what they needed, and it was safer if he went alone. He also asked for a gun, just in case. As Doc left, Jake warned him to be careful and to come back if he couldn't make it. Miley watched him go, hoping he would return with the supplies they needed. Driving through the streets of Southport, Doc noticed that everything seemed normal. Shops were open, and people were going about their business. However, he knew that something was wrong. Medical lobby on Mars was up to something, and the death notices no longer listed the cause of death. He parked the tractor behind Stan's house and knocked on the window. Molly let him in and asked how she could help. Doc asked her to hide him until it was safe to get into her laboratory. But as he entered the inner kitchen, Stan appeared, holding a gun. She had set a trap for Doc, and he had fallen for it. She revealed that the equipment he was looking for was in her office, but it wouldn't help him now. Miley sprang into action, ready to fight for his life. He anticipated her to fire, but hoped the element of surprise would throw off her aim. However, it was too late, and he viciously kicked her gun, sending it flying from her grasp. Life in the villages had toughened him in unforeseen ways. She was relatively powerless in his grip. A short while later, he had her securely bound with surgical tape that Molly had brought him. She raged furiously in the chair where he had unceremoniously dumped her, but soon gave up. "They'll catch you, Samuel Miley!" Surprisingly, there was no anger in her voice now. "You won't escape us. The planet isn't large enough." "I escaped your trial," he reminded her, "and I survived when you left me without a chance on the ground of the spaceport." She laughed harshly. "You escaped, then? You fool. Who do you think provided you with the extra battery so you could survive long enough to be helped at the spaceport? Who hired a fool like Matthews so you wouldn't receive the death penalty you deserved? Who allowed you to escape as an herbal doctor for months before you proclaimed yourself as God and a traitor to humanity once again? It shook him, as it was probably intended to do. How had she known about the extra battery? He had always assumed that Ben had returned to give it to him, but in that case, Stan couldn't be aware of it. Then he hardened himself once again. In the past, she always had one card up her sleeve that he couldn't beat and hadn't anticipated. However, too much was at stake for games now. "Is there any police around, Molly?" he inquired. Molly returned a minute later to report that everything appeared to be clear and to show him where the equipment had been set up in Stan's office. It was all there, including the electron microphone, a lovely little portable model. There was even a small incubator with its own heat source into which he immediately transferred the little bottles he had been keeping warm against his skin. Most of the equipment had never been unpacked, which made loading it onto his tractor ridiculously easy. "You should come with me now, Molly," he suggested finally. Then he turned to Stan, who was observing him with almost no expression. "You can move your chair to the phone in 30 minutes, I suppose. Knock the phone off and yell for help. It's better than you deserve, unless you genuinely did give me that battery." "You won't get away with it," she told him again, calmly this time. "No," he admitted. "Probably not. But maybe the human race will, if I have time to find a solution to the plague that you can't see under your nose. But you won't get away with it either. In the end, your kind never does." Molly was sniffling as they drove away. It was likely the best life she had ever known, Doc reasoned. Stan could be kind to the lower classes, but now Molly's job was done, and she would have to vanish into the villages. He dropped her off at the first village and drove on alone. He was itching to get to the microscope now, barely able to wait through the long journey back to Jake. His impatience grew with each mile. Finally, he gave up. He maneuvered the tractor into a narrow valley between sand dunes, leaving the engine running and lowering the blackout shades used by the locals. The cab had enough power for his equipment, and he placed the microphone on the tractor seat, preparing to examine the collection of specimens he had brought. It had been years since he last used the electron microscope, but he quickly regained his familiarity with it. His hands were tense and sweaty as he inserted the first film into the chamber. He had set the magnetic lenses to 20,000 power, but a glance at the screen showed it was too weak. He increased the power to 50,000, and the filaments became clear and distinct. He switched on the tape recorder and positioned the microphone to dictate his observations without interruption. He carefully adjusted the focus while describing his actions, then gasped in amazement. Each filament contained 3 small, dark sections, each with a triple Martian nucleus. He then placed a film with a small section of nerve tissue from a corpse into the chamber, and the filaments were thickly crowded among the nerve cells. They traveled along the nerves to reach the base of the brain before forming a larger lump. A specimen from one of the black specks was even more fascinating. The filaments were present, but some were changing into tiny, round cells with triple dark spots of nuclei. These were likely the final form that was released to infect others. Initially, they multiplied directly in epithelial tissue, causing rapid contagion of infection. Eventually, they formed filaments that invaded the nerves, causing a brief bodily reaction like Selznick's migraine. The body adapted to them, and they began to incubate slowly, developing into the large cells he had first seen. When ripe, the big cells broke apart into millions of tiny, round ones that went back to the nerve endings, causing black spots and killing the host. He increased the magnification, losing resolution but hoping to find something more at the extreme limits of the microscope. Suddenly something wet and cold hit his face, and he tried to wipe it off, but it evaporated quickly, leaving behind a thick, acrid odor. He reached for his aspirator but was already paralyzed and fell to the floor before he could escape. When he regained consciousness, it was morning outside, and Stan was waiting inside the cab with 2 large lobby policemen. A hypo in her hand must have been what revived him. She touched the electron microscope with something like affection. "The lobby technicians did a good job on this, don't you think, Dan? I warned you, but you wouldn't listen." Now we have evidence of your forbidden research, recorded by your own voice. Fool!" The woman shook her head in pity as the tractor began moving towards Southport with 2 others. "You and your fake illnesses, a minor skin condition, Selznick's headache, and a few cases of psychosis to create a new disease. Did you really think the medical lobby couldn't verify such simple things? Or did you not expect us to hear about your talk of rebellion and realize you were planning to create a new virus to wipe out the Earth forces? Maybe those messengers of yours were real, a mass murderer." She pulled out another syringe and injected it into his arm. Necrosynth, enough to keep him unconscious for 24 hours. He started to curse her, but the drug took effect before he could finish his thought.